The rain over the city felt like the sky itself was trying to wash away every lie ever told beneath it. Inside the Ashworth family penthouse, everything gleamed with the kind of wealth that was meant to hide rot, not cure it. Crystal chandeliers spilled warm light over white roses and champagne towers. A room full of alphas in tailored suits, all pretending they were here to celebrate an engagement. Everyone knew the truth. Rhys Barlow was being sold. His family's shipping empire had been bleeding money for years, and his mother had finally found the quickest solution. One Omega son, one marriage contract, one powerful alpha, old enough to have buried 3 partners before him. In return, the Barlow name would survive another decade. Rhys stood in front of the mirror while 2 attendants adjusted the collar around his throat. It wasn't a bonding collar yet, but it was close enough to make his skin crawl. His mother appeared behind him in the reflection, voice low and sharp. "Don't embarrass me tonight. Chairman Ashworth has already agreed to take you, despite your reputation." Rhys looked at her through the mirror. "My reputation? You're stubborn, cold, difficult. Omega is like you should be grateful anyone wants to bond with them at all." He smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. For months, he had sat through private dinners with alphas who looked at him like property. They asked about his heat cycle, his suppression dosage, whether he had ever been marked, whether he could produce strong alpha heirs. Some didn't even bother asking him directly. They asked his mother, as if Rhys were a clause in a contract. Tonight was supposed to be the end of it. Chairman Ashworth was waiting downstairs, a brutal alpha with too much money and too many dead spouses. Everyone acted as if that made him experienced, not dangerous. Rhys turned away from the mirror. "I need air." His mother grabbed his wrist. "You need obedience." For 1 second, Rhys looked at her hand on him. Then he pulled free. He didn't shout. He didn't cry. He simply walked out. By the time the first security guard noticed, Rhys had already slipped through the service elevator. By the time his mother screamed his name, he was crossing the underground parking lot in formal shoes never meant for running. His phone buzzed again and again in his pocket. He didn't answer. Outside, the rain hit his face, cold and hard. For the first time in years, no one was holding him still. Rhys didn't know where he was going. He only knew where he could not return. So he kept walking. The streets of the financial district gave way to older roads, dimmer lights, buildings with cracked signs. Luxury cars became delivery trucks. Perfume and wine became engine oil, rainwater, and cheap smoke. By midnight, Rhys reached the old harbor district. It was the kind of place his family would have called filthy. Warehouses lined the road. Men stood under awnings with cigarettes between their fingers. A few motorcycles were parked outside a narrow bar with a red sign flickering above the door. The place was loud enough to feel alive and dangerous enough to make most Omegas turn around. Rhys didn't turn around. When he pushed the door open, the bar slowly went quiet. People noticed his clothes first, the expensive fabric, the formal coat soaked through. Then they noticed his scent, faint beneath the suppressants, but still unmistakable. Omega. A few alphas looked up with interest. One smiled like he had just found something breakable. Rhys forced himself to keep walking. His heart was beating too fast, but his face stayed calm. He went to the counter and ordered water, because his throat was too tight for anything else. That was when the back door slammed open. The whole bar changed. Not loudly, not dramatically. It was worse than that. Conversations died one by one. Shoulders stiffened. An Omega server carrying a tray froze near the wall and lowered his eyes instantly. A man stepped inside from the rain. Rhys didn't know his name yet, but everyone else seemed to. They moved out of his path without being told. He wore a worn leather jacket, dark gloves, boots stained with mud, and something darker. His face was scarred, badly enough that most people looked once and quickly looked away. One scar cut across his cheek, another dragged near his mouth. His hands were rough, bruised, marked with old wounds no clean life could have given him. He wasn't beautiful, not in the polished way of the alphas Reese had been forced to meet. He looked like survival. A heavy alpha pheromone moved through the room, not released fully, but enough to press against the skin like a warning. It smelled dangerous, bitter and sharp, like smoke after violence. Someone near Reese whispered, "That's Kale. Don't stare." Another voice muttered, "They say he used to fight for the harbor gangs. Tore through 3 alphas in one night." An Omega came near him once and fainted from his pheromone. Reese listened, but his eyes stayed on Kale. Kale walked to the end of the bar and dropped a few bills on the counter. The bartender gave him a glass without asking. No one joked with him. No one touched him. Even the alphas watched him with careful silence. A monster, Reese thought. That was what everyone saw. But what Reese noticed was different. Kale's shoulders were tense with exhaustion. His left hand trembled once before he curled it into a fist. There was blood on his sleeve, but he acted as if pain was something he had long ago stopped expecting kindness for. Reese looked at him and felt something strange settle inside his chest. This man was not hunting him. This man was running, too. The idea came suddenly, insanely, and once it arrived, Reese could not push it away. He needed someone unsuitable, someone his mother would never accept, someone so far beneath her standards that she would have no choice but to cut him loose forever. And this alpha, this scarred, feared, ruined man at the end of the bar, was the most unsuitable person Reese had ever seen. So Reese stood. A few people noticed and went still. The bartender's eyes widened slightly, as if he wanted to warn him not to do it. Reese crossed the room anyway. Cal didn't look at him until Reese stopped at his side. Up close, the alpha was even more intimidating. The scars were deeper. The pheromone was heavier. But Reese didn't step back. Cal slowly turned his head. His eyes narrowed. "You're lost." His voice was rough, low, tired. Reese swallowed once. "No, I'm looking for someone. This is the wrong place for an Omega like you." Kale studied him, then looked past him toward the door, as if expecting guards to rush in. "Who sent you?" "No one." "That's hard to believe." Reese took a breath. His hands were cold, but his voice came out clear. "Are you bonded?" The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Someone behind them cursed under his breath. Kel stared at him. "What?" "I asked if you were bonded." The alpha's expression darkened, not with anger exactly, but with suspicion. "Do you ask every dangerous stranger that question?" "No, just you." Kel leaned back slightly, as if Reese had become more dangerous than anyone else in the room. "No, I'm not bonded." Relief hit Reese so hard it almost made him dizzy. "Good," he said. "Then marry me." This time, the whole bar heard. The bartender stopped wiping the counter. The Omega server covered his mouth. Somewhere behind them, an alpha let out a disbelieving laugh that quickly died when Kyle glanced in his direction. Kyle stood very slowly. He was taller than Reese expected. Larger, too. His shadow fell over him, and his pheromone sharpened, testing, warning, almost asking if Reese understood the risk. Reese's instincts told him to lower his eyes. He did not. Cal looked at him for a long moment, then said quietly, "You have no idea what kind of man you're speaking to." Reese thought of Chairman Ashworth waiting beneath golden lights. He thought of his mother's hand around his wrist. He thought of a lifetime of being owned politely by people who called it protection. Then he looked at Kale's scarred face and said, "I know enough." Something changed in Kale's eyes. For the first time, the hardness cracked, just slightly. Reese stepped closer before fear could stop him. "I need a legal marriage. No bond, no claim, no questions. I can pay you a little, not much right now, but enough to help you leave this place if you want." Kale's jaw tightened. "You're running from someone." "Yes." "A family." "Yes." "An alpha." Reese's silence was answer enough. The air around Kale grew colder, not gentle, not safe, but focused. He looked toward the rain-streaked window, then back at Reese. "And you thought marrying me was the better option?" Reese gave a small, bitter smile. You are exactly the kind of alpha my family would rather die than accept. For a moment, Keel didn't speak. Then he lowered his voice until only Reese could hear. Do you know what people call me? Reese held his gaze. Keel leaned closer, scars catching the bar's dim light, his pheromone pressing around them like a locked door. They call me a monster. Reese's heartbeat thundered, but he did not move away. Keel looked into his eyes and asked, So tell me, Omega, are you still asking me to marry you? Kyle stared at Reese for so long that the entire bar seemed afraid to breathe. For one terrible second, Reese thought the alpha might laugh in his face or simply walk away. But instead, Kale's eyes moved slowly across him again, taking in the soaked formal clothes, the trembling fingers pretending not to shake, the exhaustion hidden beneath expensive perfection. Something unreadable darkened his expression. You really are desperate, he muttered quietly, almost to himself. Then he grabbed his drink and turned toward the exit. Rice's stomach dropped, but before disappointment could fully settle in, Kyle stopped near the door and spoke without looking back. If you're serious, come with me. If you're not, go home before somebody worse than me notices you. That was not acceptance exactly, but it was enough. Reese followed him into the rain without hesitation. The drive across the city happened in silence. Inside an old truck that smelled faintly of smoke, engine oil, and Kale's heavy alpha pheromone, sharp enough to make Reese aware of every nervous beat of his own pulse. Kale kept one scarred hand on the wheel, while the other rested loosely near the gear shift. His posture was tense in the way of someone who never truly relaxed, even while driving through empty streets after midnight. Reese noticed old bruises near his knuckles and faded bite scars near his wrist, marks that looked disturbingly close to old rut injuries. He wanted to ask questions, but something about Kale warned him not to pry too quickly. Eventually, the alpha spoke first. You still haven't explained why you picked me. Reese looked out the rain-covered window. Because everyone else looked at me like they already owned me. Kale gave a humorless laugh. And you think I won't? You haven't tried yet. Silence settled again after that, heavier than before. The courthouse opened at 9 a.m. By 8:30, Reese sat beside Kale on a metal bench across the street, clutching a cup of terrible vending machine coffee while exhaustion dragged at every part of his body. He hadn't slept at all. His phone had died hours ago from endless calls and messages, but before it went dark, he had seen enough headlines to know the scandal was already spreading. Barlow Omega vanishes before engagement party, family collapse imminent. The comments beneath had been worse. Some called him unstable. Others called him ungrateful. A few simply called him what society always called Omegas who refused obedience. Broken. You can still leave, Kale said suddenly. Reese turned toward him. The alpha looked strangely uncomfortable sitting there in daylight among ordinary people heading to work. Even hidden beneath a dark hoodie and old jacket, he radiated danger too naturally to blend in. Several passing Omegas glanced toward him before quickly lowering their eyes. One even crossed the street entirely after catching a whiff of his pheromone. He'll notice too. He always noticed. I'm not forcing you into this, he continued quietly. Once your name is attached to mine, people will talk. They'll say worse things than they already are. Reese looked at the scars crossing the side of his face and answered honestly. They already hated me before I met you. Something flickered briefly in Kale's eyes before disappearing again. The wedding itself lasted less than 15 minutes. No flowers, no guests, no music, just a tired courthouse employee, 2 signatures, an illegal contract binding an Omega runaway to a scarred alpha everyone in the district seemed afraid of. Reese read every line twice before signing, especially the sections guaranteeing his freedom to leave at any time and prohibiting permanent marking without explicit consent. He noticed that immediately, most alphas with power would have demanded ownership first. Hill demanded boundaries. When the employee finally handed them the marriage documents, Reese expected to feel panic or regret. Instead, he felt something stranger, relief. Like the first full breath after being held underwater too long. The relief lasted exactly until his bank card stopped working. By afternoon, every account tied to the Barlow family had been frozen. His mother had officially removed him from inheritance records before the news cycle even finished updating. By evening, several media outlets were already calling him the disgraced Omega who married beneath his status. Hale read one article while standing beside a gas station counter, then quietly folded the newspaper before Reese could see the rest. "You don't have to hide it," Reese said flatly. "I know what they're saying." Kyle glanced at him once. People with too much money usually say boring things anyway. The house sat far outside the city, near an old industrial district slowly being reclaimed by woods and hills. The moment Kale unlocked the front door, Reese understood just how completely he had destroyed his old life. The place was small enough that he could see nearly the entire house from the entrance alone. One worn couch, one tiny kitchen, a narrow hallway leading toward a bathroom and bedroom. The heater rattled loudly the moment Kale turned it on, and somewhere near the ceiling, water dripped into a metal bucket with soft, repetitive sounds. "The roof leaks when it rains hard," Kale said casually, setting his keys down. "I'll fix it eventually." Reese stared at him. "You actually live here?" Unfortunately, for the first time since leaving home, panic hit him properly. Not because the house was poor, but because it was real. There were no servants waiting nearby, no backup plan hidden beneath the disaster. He had truly traded the world he knew for this quiet little house, shared with a dangerous stranger, carrying enough scars to frighten half the city. Kyle seemed to notice the fear settling across his face, because his shoulders tightened immediately. "You can take the bedroom. I'll sleep on the couch." Reese blinked. "You don't have to." "I know." Kale pulled off his jacket slowly, revealing more scars climbing along his throat and forearms like old cracks in stone. "But I'm an alpha in rut season, living alone with an omega who barely knows me. Trust me, distance is smarter." The next few days passed awkwardly, tense in ways neither of them fully understood yet. Reese burned instant noodles twice trying to cook, while Kale silently ate the ruined meals anyway. Kale disappeared for hours doing dangerous-looking jobs around the harbor district and returned smelling like smoke, rain, and blood. He never explained. At night, Reese could hear him pacing the living room when the house became too quiet, as if sleep avoided him entirely. Yet beneath the awkwardness, something softer slowly began forming. Kale always noticed when Reese's suppressants were running low and replaced them before being asked. He adjusted the heater whenever Reese shivered without admitting he was cold. Once, during a heavy storm, the electricity failed completely, and Reese woke suddenly to find Kale sitting silently beside the couch, holding a flashlight. Because the thunder had triggered Omega instincts, Reese was too embarrassed to confess aloud. The strangest part was the way Kale never touched him unnecessarily. Every alpha Reese had ever known used physical contact like ownership. Hands on wrists, waists, necks. Kale avoided contact so carefully it almost felt deliberate. Sometimes Reese would catch the alpha stepping backward whenever pheromones thickened too much inside the small house. Sometimes Kale even held his breath while passing close by. One night, Reese woke thirsty and walked quietly toward the kitchen, only to freeze halfway down the hallway when he saw Kale sitting alone near the sink under dim light. His shirt was discarded beside him while he wrapped fresh bandages around his ribs. Bruises darkened nearly every inch of exposed skin. Old knife wounds crossed his shoulders. Bite scars marked his collarbone, and lower along his back, Reese noticed the ugliest scars of all. Deep claw marks carved brutally across muscle, like someone had once tried to tear him apart before he could stop them. He stepped closer before he could think. Kale looked up instantly, instinct sharpening. For a second, neither moved. Then Reese slowly reached out and touched one faded scar near his shoulder blade. Kill's entire body stiffened. "Don't," he said roughly, grabbing his shirt too quickly. "You shouldn't look at this." Reese frowned slightly. "Why?" Kill looked away first. "Because it's ugly." The answer hit harder than Reese expected. This terrifying alpha everyone feared. This man built like violence itself, sounded genuinely convinced he was too ruined to be seen. Reese stared at him quietly before answering in a soft voice Keel clearly did not expect. "I don't think you're ugly at all." Cal froze completely. Outside, rain hammered softly against the windows while silence stretched between them, thick and unfamiliar. And for the first time since the strange marriage began, Reese saw something dangerous crack open behind the alpha's guarded expression. Not anger, not lust, something far worse. Hope. The weather turned colder during the second week of their marriage, and with the cold came something far more dangerous than leaking roofs or unpaid bills. Reese felt that before he understood it properly, a restless heat building slowly beneath his skin, making his body too sensitive and his emotions too sharp around the edges. At first, he blamed stress and exhaustion, because nearly everything in his life had changed too quickly. But deep down, he already knew the truth. His heat cycle was coming early. That should not have happened. The suppressants he had taken for years were expensive, professionally monitored, and specifically designed for high-status omegas constantly surrounded by aggressive alpha pheromones. The cheaper placements available near the harbor district were weaker, unstable, and barely enough to suppress someone under ordinary conditions. Living inside a tiny house saturated every day with Kale's scent was the opposite of ordinary, especially because Kale smelled dangerous even when calm. Reese noticed it most during evenings when the alpha returned from work exhausted and sweaty, shoulders tense beneath worn black shirts, while faint traces of blood or engine grease lingered on his hands. Some nights he smelled like cold rain and smoke. Other nights he smelled like violence barely restrained beneath skin. The pheromones wrapped around the small house until Reese could feel them sinking into blankets, furniture, even his own clothes. And his body was reacting. By the third night, sleep became impossible. Reese tossed restlessly beneath the blankets while heat crawled painfully through his veins, leaving his thoughts unfocused and his pulse unstable. Every sound from the living room sharpened unbearably. He could hear Kale moving quietly near the kitchen sink, hear the slow scrape of a lighter, hear the steady breathing of an alpha trying not to enter the hallway, trying not to come near him. That somehow made everything worse. Reese sat up slowly and pressed shaking fingers against his forehead. His skin burned. The scent glands near his neck throbbed painfully beneath his collar, releasing pheromones faster than the suppressants could contain them. Sweet omega scent spread through the bedroom despite every effort to control it. The house immediately went silent. A few seconds later, Kale's voice came low and strained from the other side of the wall. "Reese." Just hearing his name spoken like that sent another wave of heat through him. "I'm fine," Reese lied quickly. "No, you're not." The answer came instantly, rougher now, tighter around the edges. Reese swallowed hard and forced himself out of bed, only for dizziness to hit him so hard he nearly collapsed against the wall. The bedroom door cracked open a second later. Then Kale froze at the entrance. For one terrifying moment, neither of them moved. Kale looked worse than Reese had ever seen him. His pupils were blown wide. Black veins stood sharply beneath the skin of his throat, and his jaw remained clenched so tightly the muscles twitched visibly beneath old scars. The pheromones rolling off him were no longer controlled carefully. They flooded the hallway, heavy and violent enough to make breathing difficult. An alpha nearing rut, and all of it focused entirely on Reese. Kale stepped backward immediately, like he had touched fire. "Close the door." Reese stared at him. "Close the damn door." The sharpness in his voice made Reese flinch. Kyle saw it instantly. Horror crossed his face. He dragged one shaking hand through his hair before turning away completely. "I'm sorry," he muttered roughly. "Just stay inside tonight." Then he disappeared. A minute later, the front door slammed open. Cold wind rushed through the house. Rhys stood frozen in the hallway before finally forcing himself toward the window. What he saw made something twist painfully inside his chest. Keel sat outside in the snow beside the back steps, wearing nothing but a thin shirt despite freezing weather. Elbows resting against his knees, he fought for control so hard that even from inside, Rhys could see the trembling in his body. One hand was pressed violently against his own mouth, as if physically stopping himself from returning inside. Rhys had spent his entire life around powerful alphas. Not one of them would have walked away. Most would have considered his heat an invitation. Some would have enjoyed watching an Omega beg. Others would have used instinct as an excuse for whatever they wanted. Kyle looked like he would rather tear himself apart than touch Rhys without permission. Hours passed slowly after that. The storm outside worsened while the temperature dropped lower and lower. Yet Kale stayed there, unmoving beneath falling snow. Around midnight, Rhys heard a sudden crack from outside, followed by a muffled curse. He rushed toward the back door without thinking. Kale stood near the wooden fence, breathing heavily, one fist buried halfway through frozen timber. Blood covered his knuckles. "Rhys," he warned immediately when he saw him step outside. "Go back in." The scent in the air hit Rhys brutally now. Alpha pheromones soaked with restraint, pain, and something dangerously close to losing control. Kale's eyes locked onto him for one terrible second before he looked away, hard enough to seem angry at himself for it. "You're bleeding," Rhys whispered. "I know. Why are you doing this to yourself?" Kale laughed once under his breath, exhausted and bitter. "Because you smell like heaven right now, and my instincts are telling me to drag you back inside and lock every door between you and the world." His voice roughened further. "And because I know exactly what kind of monster I become when Rut takes over." Rhys stepped closer anyway. Kyle instantly backed away. "Don't." The word came almost desperate. "Please." That stopped Rhys more effectively than shouting ever could. "Please." Not a command. Not alpha authority. Fear. Keel was afraid of himself. Snow melted slowly against dark strands of hair falling across his scarred face, while blood dripped steadily from his damaged knuckles. For the first time since meeting him, Rhys realized Kale genuinely believed hurting him was inevitable. Like violence was written permanently into his body. Something inside Rhys softened painfully. "You're cold," he said quietly. "I'd rather freeze." The answer nearly broke him. Rhys walked forward before fear could stop him and grabbed Kale's wrist. The reaction was immediate. Kale inhaled sharply, like the contact physically hurt him. His pheromones surged violently, enough to shake Rhys's instincts. But instead of pulling him closer, Kale tried to pull away. Rhys held on tighter. "Look at me." Kale refused. "Kale, look at me." Slowly, reluctantly, Kale lifted his head. Snow clung to the scars crossing his cheek and throat. His eyes looked wrecked with restraint. And still, even now, he was trying to protect him. Rhys moved closer until their bodies nearly touched. He could feel heat radiating through Kale despite the freezing weather. Could hear the uneven breathing of an alpha barely holding himself together. "You're not a monster," Rhys whispered. Kale's expression twisted slightly. "You don't know that. Then why are you the only alpha who's ever tried this hard not to hurt me?" Silence. The storm around them faded beneath the sound of harsh breathing and pounding hearts. Kale lowered his voice, slowly, carefully, like every word hurt to say. "Because if I touch you right now, I won't want to stop." The honesty of it sent heat rushing through Rhys all over again. Yet strangely, he was no longer afraid. Instead, he stepped even closer and rested one hand carefully against Kale's scarred face. The alpha went completely still. "No one's ever touched me during Rut without wanting something." Kyle admitted quietly. Reese looked at him for several long seconds before gently pulling him toward the house. Then come inside. Kyle resisted weakly at first. Reese, I trust you. Those 3 words shattered something. Reese saw it happen in real time behind Kyle's eyes. Slowly, like a man approaching something sacred he did not deserve, Kyle allowed himself to follow him back into the warmth of the house. They sat together on the floor beside the couch, because neither trusted themselves with the bed, and for a long time, neither spoke. Kyle kept his hands locked tightly into fists. Reese leaned carefully against his shoulder, listening to the alpha's heartbeat struggle for calm. Eventually, the trembling eased. Eventually, the pheromones softened. And somewhere near dawn, Reese tilted his head upward and pressed a small, gentle kiss against one scar near Kale's mouth. Kyle froze instantly. Reese pulled back just enough to whisper against his skin, "Thank you for not making me afraid of you." For several seconds, Kyle simply stared at him, like he had forgotten how breathing worked. Then, very slowly, carefully enough to feel almost painful, the alpha rested his forehead against Reese's and closed his eyes. Neither noticed the sunlight beginning to rise outside. Neither realized this was the exact moment everything between them stopped being fake. After the night of Reese's heat, something inside the house changed so quietly that neither of them knew exactly when it happened. Only that the distance between them no longer felt natural. Before, they had moved around each other carefully, like strangers forced into temporary proximity, always aware of invisible boundaries neither wanted to cross too quickly. Now, the air between them carried something warmer, heavier, and infinitely more dangerous, because both of them had started wanting things they were no longer pretending not to feel. Cal still slept on the couch most nights, but not because he wanted to anymore. Reese noticed the difference immediately. The alpha had become more restless around him in ways both subtle and impossible to ignore. Kale's hand would settle briefly against Reese's lower back while guiding him through crowded streets, then immediately pull away like he had touched fire. He would stand too close while cooking, broad shoulders nearly brushing Reese's, his scent wrapping unconsciously around the omega, until even simple conversations began feeling intimate. Whenever another alpha looked at Reese too long in public, Kale's pheromones sharpened instantly with quiet territorial warning. And every single time it happened, Kale looked furious at himself afterward. That contradiction fascinated Reese more than it should have. Because Kale was possessive, absolutely, but never controlling. His instincts wanted to guard, protect, keep close. Yet he treated Reese's freedom like something sacred. Even during moments when his alpha nature surfaced strongest, Kale still asked before touching him, still stepped back whenever Reese looked overwhelmed, still acted like earning trust mattered more than claiming ownership. No one had ever treated Reese that gently before, which was exactly why he was falling in love with him. The realization arrived one rainy evening while they stood together in a tiny grocery store near the industrial district. Reese had wandered toward the refrigerated section, searching for suppressants, while Kale argued quietly with the cashier over cigarette prices. 2 young alphas entered the store, laughing loudly before stopping abruptly when they noticed Reese standing alone. Their scent hit him first, aggressive, curious, interested. One of them smirked. Didn't expect to see an omega around here looking like that. Reese instantly stiffened. Old instincts returned immediately. Years of upper-class alpha attention, teaching him exactly how dangerous certain tones of voice could become. Before he could answer, another scent flooded the aisle. Sharp, smoke, cold steel, violence held on a leash. Kale appeared beside him, so suddenly it almost startled him. The scarred alpha said nothing at first, only stood there with one hand resting loosely in his jacket pocket while his pheromones rolled slowly through the air, thick enough to crush conversation entirely. The 2 younger alphas went pale almost immediately. One muttered under his breath, Shit, that's Mackenzie. They left seconds later without another word. Cale waited until they disappeared outside before speaking quietly. You okay? Reese stared at him. They recognized you. Cale's expression closed instantly. People around the harbor know me. That's not what they called you. Silence. Cale grabbed the shopping basket and started walking toward the counter. Drop it. But Reese could not. Because over the past few weeks, too many things had stopped making sense. Men twice Cale's size avoided eye contact around him. Dangerous people treated him with nervous respect. Once, Reese had seen a black luxury car parked outside the neighborhood for nearly an hour before disappearing the moment Cale stepped outside, holding a knife. And then there were the phone calls. They came late at night, when Cale thought Reese was asleep. He never answered them. Yet the moment his phone vibrated, something dark always settled over his expression. Afterward, Reese began noticing everything. The way Cale automatically checked exits whenever entering buildings. The expense of combat scars no ordinary gang member should survive. The fact that he spoke fluent business language during rare moments of frustration made him careless. The expensive watch hidden beneath old sleeves. The tattoo near his ribs, partially burned away on purpose, as if someone had tried erasing a past identity. Cale was lying about something enormous. The truth finally arrived 3 days later. It was early morning when black cars rolled silently into the dirt road outside the house. Not one or two, 6. Reese looked up from breakfast just as Cale went completely still near the sink. For the first time since meeting him, Reese saw genuine fear cross the alpha's face. Not fear for himself, fear for what was about to reach their door. A moment later, someone knocked. 3 precise taps. Cale closed his eyes briefly before speaking in a low voice. Stay inside the bedroom. Reese stood immediately. No, Reese. No more secrets. The alpha stared at him for several long seconds before finally looking away with exhausted resignation. Slowly, he walked toward the door and opened it. Every instinct in Reese's body screamed danger. Men in black suits stood outside in perfect silence. All of them alphas, all carrying enough restrained pheromones to reveal serious training. The one standing in front looked older, sharp-eyed, and terrifyingly calm. The moment he saw Cale, he lowered his head slightly. Welcome back, sir. Sir. Reese felt the room tilt slightly beneath him. Cale's jaw tightened hard enough to show muscle beneath old scars. I told the council not to follow me here. We did not have a choice. The older alpha finally lifted his eyes. The board meeting has already begun. You left. No, Cale said flatly. I disappeared. Silence spread through the small house. Reese looked slowly toward Cale, whose expression had become unreadable. The older alpha noticed him. Then, for one dangerous second, the entire room changed. The man's gaze sharpened immediately on Reese. Scent, wedding ring, obvious omega pheromones lingering throughout the house. Shock flickered across his controlled expression. You bonded? No, Cale answered coldly. We're married. That's all. Stillness again. Then the older alpha spoke words that shattered the last illusion completely. The Mackenzie board is aware of your marriage, heir. Reese stopped breathing. Cale looked exhausted suddenly. Painfully exhausted. Like a man who had spent years outrunning chains only to hear them locking around him again. The older alpha continued carefully. Your grandfather is dead. The council wants you back immediately, before the shareholders panic. Reese stared at Cale in disbelief. Mackenzie. Cale did not answer, because he did not need to. Everyone knew that name. Mackenzie Holdings was not just another corporation. It controlled half the city's underground trade routes, security industries, political investments, and private military contracts. In upper-class ABO society, the Mackenzie family had one reputation above all: monsters. Powerful alpha bloodlines obsessed with dominance, succession, and control. And standing in the middle of this tiny, leaking house was their missing heir. Reese stepped backward slowly. You're telling me, this whole time, his voice faltered. You're one of them? Kel finally looked at him directly. And somehow that hurt worse, because there was no arrogance in his expression, only quiet defeat. I was. The older alpha glanced between them carefully before lowering his voice. Sir, we need to leave before. No, Kale's tone turned lethal instantly. You don't speak while he's here. The room went deadly silent. Even the other alphas subtly lowered their eyes. Reese noticed that immediately too. They feared Kale. Not respected. Feared. His stomach tightened painfully. Kale dragged one hand down his face before speaking without looking at anyone. Give us 10 minutes. The older alpha hesitated only briefly before nodding and leading the others outside. The moment the door closed, silence crushed the room completely. Reese stared at the man he had married and realized he suddenly knew nothing at all. Kale remained motionless near the entrance, broad shoulders tense beneath scars, exhaustion written into every line of his body. Finally, Reese asked the question burning through him. Who are you really? Kyle laughed quietly then, but there was nothing amused in the sound. A weapon, he answered. That's what they raised me to be. Slowly, he pulled back his sleeve, revealing more scars than Reese had ever seen before. Old bite marks layered over knife wounds and burned scars crossing his arms, like violence had spent years carving ownership directly into flesh. My family trains alphas like attack dogs. Rut control, gang wars, enforcement, punishment. His voice stayed calm, which somehow made it worse. Most of these came before I turned 20. Reese felt sick. Kyle looked toward the rain-covered window while continuing quietly. The harbor gangs worked for Mackenzie territory. I handled problems the family didn't want traced back to them. His jaw tightened slightly. People started calling me a monster after a while, because it was easier than calling me what I really was. And what was that? Kyle finally met his eyes again. Useful. The word landed like a knife. Everything suddenly made terrible sense. The fear around him, the violence in his instincts, the way Kale treated affection like something fragile he did not deserve to touch. Reese swallowed hard. Then why run away? For the first time, real emotion cracked visibly across Kale's face. Because one day, I realized nobody looked at me like a person anymore. His voice lowered. Not my family. Not other alphas. Not omegas. He looked directly at Reese then. Until you. The confession hit harder than Reese expected. Kale stepped closer, slowly, carefully, as if approaching something breakable. The night you walked into that bar and asked me to marry me, a faint, bitter smile touched his scarred mouth. You looked terrified, exhausted, and completely insane. His eyes softened painfully, but you still looked at me without fear. Reese's chest tightened. Outside, one of the black cars started its engine. Kale glanced toward the sound briefly before speaking words that turned the air cold again. The board knows about you now. Reese frowned. What does that mean? Kale went silent. And somehow, that silence felt far more dangerous than any answer. Finally, he spoke quietly. It means if I don't go back with them, his eyes darkened with something close to dread. They'll see you as my weakness. For the very first time since meeting him, Reese saw genuine panic inside Kale Mackenzie's eyes. Kyle left with the Mackenzie men the next morning. But before he walked out of the house, he stopped beside Reese near the kitchen doorway and held his gaze for several quiet seconds, like he was trying to memorize something he might lose. The exhaustion in his face looked deeper now that the truth was finally exposed. You should stay somewhere safer for a while, Kale said quietly. The harbor district has people loyal to me. I can arrange security. Reese crossed his arms immediately. You mean hide me? I mean protect you. Same thing. Kale's jaw tightened slightly. You don't understand what kind of people the Mackenzie board deals with. And you don't understand how tired I am of people deciding where I belong. The alpha looked like he wanted to argue. Instead, he exhaled slowly through his nose and stepped closer. his pheromones wrapped carefully around Reese, protective without becoming oppressive. And somehow, that only made leaving harder. "I'll fix this quickly," Kale muttered. "Then we come back here." The word "we" settled painfully warm inside Reese's chest. Before he could answer, Kale lifted one scarred hand toward his face, hesitated halfway, like touching him might still be forbidden, then gently brushed damp strands of hair away from Reese's eyes. The touch lasted barely 2 seconds. It still felt intimate enough to steal breath from his lungs. 3 days later, the entire country knew. Every major news channel exploded with headlines the second Kale reappeared publicly at Mackenzie Holdings. Security footage captured the scarred alpha stepping from a black armored vehicle while armed escorts surrounded him on all sides. Reporters called him the lost heir returned from exile. Financial analysts predicted bloodshed inside the company. Online forums dug up old gang rumors and crime stories attached to his name. The internet became obsessed with the mystery Omega he had secretly married. And unfortunately, Reese's face was already everywhere. Former socialites who once praised his elegance now called him manipulative. Talk show hosts openly debated whether Kale had coerced him into marriage. Others claimed Reese had seduced the Mackenzie heir intentionally to restore the ruined Barlow family. Every version of the story treated him like an object passed between powerful alphas, exactly what he had tried to escape. By the end of the week, reporters were waiting outside the industrial district. Kale responded by doubling security around the house so aggressively it became impossible to ignore how dangerous his world truly was. Armed men began patrolling nearby streets at night. Expensive black vehicles parked outside constantly. Once, Reese watched 3 trained alphas immediately lower their heads the moment Kale entered a room during a security briefing. Fear, not respect. Fear followed Kale everywhere. The strangest part was that Kale himself seemed completely unaware of how terrifying he could be. Whenever he returned home late at night after meetings with the Mackenzie board, exhaustion dragged heavily through every movement. He stopped sleeping almost entirely. The old nightmares returned worse than before. Twice, Reese woke to the sound of furniture breaking downstairs after Kale forced himself through another violent flashback alone, rather than risk frightening him. One night, Reese finally walked into the kitchen at 2 a.m. to find Kale standing shirtless beside the sink, blood dripping slowly from reopened scars across his knuckles where he had punched the wall hard enough to crack plaster. Kale immediately straightened. "You should be asleep." Reese ignored the warning completely and grabbed the first aid kit instead. "Sit down." "I'm fine." "You're bleeding on the floor." For once, Kale actually listened. The alpha sat silently while Reese cleaned blood from his hands beneath dim kitchen light. The contrast between them suddenly felt surreal. The most feared alpha in the city sat completely still while an Omega patched his wounds. Broad shoulders tensed beneath layers of old scars that violence had carved into him long before Reese ever arrived. "You hate this place," Reese said quietly while wrapping fresh bandages around his hand. Kyle gave a tired laugh. "I hate what it turns me into." Reese looked up. "A monster?" Kyle's eyes darkened immediately. "You saw how those men react to me. Because they're afraid. They should be." The answer came too fast. Silence stretched briefly before Reese reached up without thinking and touched the scar crossing Kale's cheek. The alpha froze instantly beneath his fingers. "You know what I think?" Reese asked softly. "I think they spent so many years treating you like a weapon that eventually you started believing it too." Something painful flickered behind Kale's eyes before he suddenly caught Reese's wrist, gently, dangerously gently. "You shouldn't say things like that to me," he murmured. "Why?" "Because it makes me want things I shouldn't." Heat climbed slowly into Reese's chest. The air between them thickened immediately with pheromones neither fully controlled anymore. Kale noticed first. He released Reese's wrist instantly and leaned back hard enough to physically re-establish distance. But the moment still lingered there between them, heavy, unfinished. Everything changed again after the Mackenzie board announced a public shareholder gala. Cale originally refused to bring Reese, insisting the event would be dangerous, humiliating, and full of people who would deliberately provoke him. Reese responded by calmly putting on his coat and informing Cale that if he intended to survive this marriage, he needed to stop treating him like something fragile. So they attended together. The gala took place inside one of the tallest towers in the city, every surface polished enough to reflect wealth back at itself endlessly. The moment Cale entered the ballroom beside Reese, the entire atmosphere shifted. Conversations lowered instantly. Some alphas looked away first. Others stared openly at the scars across Cale's face with poorly hidden unease. Reese could physically feel the tension in the room pressing toward them. Yet Cale's hand remained firm against the small of his back the entire night. Protective, possessive, careful. The board members were worse than the media. Cold-eyed alphas in expensive suits questioned Reese indirectly all evening, asking whether he was adjusting well to Mackenzie expectations or whether Cale's instincts had become manageable since marriage. One older alpha even smiled while saying, "You must be very brave, Omega. Most people wouldn't willingly sleep beside that creature." Cale's pheromones exploded instantly. Wine glasses shattered across nearby tables. The entire ballroom fell silent for one terrifying second. Reese finally understood what everyone else saw when they looked at Cale Mackenzie. The alpha standing beside him radiated pure dominance so violently that weaker alphas physically stepped backward on instinct. Security moved immediately. Several Omegas near the ballroom entrance lowered their heads in fear. And at the center of it all, Cale stared at the board member with murder in his eyes. "Reese," he said quietly without looking away, "tell me to stop." The entire room froze harder somehow. Because that was the terrifying truth about Kyle. Even enraged, even drowning in alpha instinct, he still gave Reese control. Reese stepped closer slowly and placed one hand against Cale's chest. "The only person in this room who's never treated me like property is him." Silence crashed through the ballroom. Several reporters immediately rushed forward. Cameras flashed everywhere. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Reese stopped feeling ashamed. Let them talk. Let them stare. Cale looked down at him with something dangerously close to heartbreak in his eyes. Unfortunately, other people noticed that look too. Especially Mackenzie enemies. The attack happened 2 nights later. Reese left a downtown pharmacy just after sunset, carrying fresh suppressants, when a black van stopped beside the curb. The moment the doors opened, Omega instinct screamed danger, too late. Someone grabbed him hard enough to cut off breath, while another alpha injected suppressant blockers into his neck. The world blurred instantly. The last thing Reese heard before darkness swallowed him was one terrified voice whispering into a phone nearby. "Shit. Mackenzie is going to kill us." Miles away, inside a Mackenzie board meeting, Cale suddenly stopped breathing. Every alpha in the room looked toward him immediately. The bond was not official. There was no mark. And yet the scent of Reese's blood hit Cale's instincts like a knife directly through the spine. The glass in his hand shattered instantly. Silence filled the room. Then, slowly, horrifyingly slowly, Cale lifted his head. The pheromones flooding from him no longer felt human. One board member actually stepped backward. Another whispered, "God help whoever touched his Omega." But Cale said nothing. Because the look in his eyes already promised something far worse than death. Reese woke with a pounding headache and a metallic taste of suppressant blockers burning through his throat. For several disoriented seconds, he could not understand where he was. The room around him looked more like an abandoned warehouse than a place meant to hold people. rust stained the walls. A single light flickered weakly overhead. His wrists were restrained, loosely enough to keep him from running, but tightly enough to remind him escape was not expected. Somewhere nearby, water dripped steadily into silence. Then the smell hit him. Fear. Alpha pheromones saturated the buildings so heavily that even through the drugs clouding his senses, Reese could feel the aggression crawling beneath the air. His omega instincts reacted immediately, heartbeat accelerating while nausea twisted through his stomach. Someone had intentionally blocked his suppressants to make him vulnerable. The realization made his blood run cold. A door slammed somewhere outside the room, followed by hurried voices. "He's already moving. You said Mackenzie wouldn't find us this fast." That was before the Omega scent leaked. "He killed 3 men at the docks an hour ago." Silence followed that sentence. Real fear, this time. Reese closed his eyes briefly, because suddenly he could picture it too clearly. Kale standing in blood and broken concrete, with that terrifying look from the boardroom still burning behind his eyes. For weeks, everyone around him had warned him what kind of alpha Kale really was when pushed too far. Reese had never fully believed them, because Kale had only ever been gentle with him. Now someone else was about to learn the difference between kindness and restraint. The warehouse erupted into chaos less than 20 minutes later. Gunshots echoed outside first, then screaming. Then the unmistakable crash of heavy metal doors being torn open hard enough to shake the walls. One alpha near Reese cursed violently and reached for his weapon before another scent slammed through the room like an explosion. Kale. The pheromones hit so hard that several weaker alphas physically staggered. No control remained in them now. No careful restraint. No distance. This was pure alpha instinct stripped down to something ancient and lethal. Smoke, blood, violence, obsession. Every survival instinct in Reese's body reacted instantly, not with fear, recognition, mind. The thought did not even feel fully human. A body crashed through the doorway seconds later. Reese barely recognized Kale at first. Blood covered his shirt and hands. One side of his face was bruised badly enough to darken old scars further. His breathing sounded rough, uneven, almost animal beneath the suffocating weight of uncontrolled pheromones flooding the warehouse. 2 unconscious alphas lay motionless behind him in the hallway. The men guarding Reese froze completely. Keel looked at them once. Only once. "Move," he said quietly. One alpha actually raised his gun. The next few seconds happened too fast for Reese to follow properly. Kale crossed the room with terrifying speed and slammed the man into the concrete wall hard enough to crack it. Another attacker lunged from behind, only to hit the floor choking beneath crushing pheromones before Kale even touched him. Monster. Now Reese understood why the entire city feared that word attached to Kale's name. Because when the alpha stopped holding himself back, he became genuinely horrifying. And yet, the moment Kale reached Reese, everything changed again. His hands shook violently while undoing the restraints. Not from rage anymore. Fear. "Did they hurt you?" Kale's voice sounded wrecked beyond recognition. "Tell me if they touched you." Reese stared at him silently for a second. Blood was dripping steadily from a knife wound near Kale's ribs, and yet the alpha looked completely unaware of it. "Kale, did they hurt you?" The desperation in his voice hit harder than the violence outside ever could. Reese grabbed his face immediately. "I'm okay." Kale closed his eyes so tightly it looked painful. For one brief second, his forehead dropped against Reese's shoulder like a man moments away from collapsing. Then more footsteps echoed nearby. Kyle instantly pulled back, instincts sharpening again. "We have to leave." The drive afterward blurred together through sirens, rain, and adrenaline. Kale barely spoke at all, one hand locked tightly around the steering wheel, while the other stayed pressed hard against the wand in his side. Blood soaked through his fingers steadily. Reese tried asking how badly he was injured 3 separate times before Kale finally muttered, "Not dying yet," in a tone too exhausted for humor. By the time they reached a private medical facility owned by Mackenzie Security, Kale was struggling to stay conscious. Doctors rushed toward them immediately, but the moment one alpha nurse reached for Reese, Kale reacted on instinct. A warning growl ripped from his throat, low enough to freeze the entire hallway. The nurse stepped back instantly. Cal looked horrified at himself seconds later. "I'm sorry," he rasped roughly, breathing hard. "Don't touch him right now." Reese's chest tightened painfully, even half delirious from blood loss and rut instincts. Kale was still trying not to frighten him. Hours passed before the surgery finally ended. Reese sat alone beside the hospital window long after midnight, staring down at city lights while exhaustion hollowed him out from the inside. The doctors insisted Kale would recover, but they also admitted something else quietly. The alpha had pushed his body far beyond safe limits because rut and emotional instability had completely destroyed his restraint during the rescue. One doctor even whispered carefully, "If he had already marked you officially, the pheromone feedback could have killed everyone inside that warehouse." That thought stayed with Reese long after the room emptied. Near dawn, Kale finally woke. The first thing he did was search the room frantically until his eyes landed on Reese sitting beside the bed. Relief hit his face so openly it almost hurt to witness. "Reese, I'm here." Kale relaxed slightly against the pillows before immediately trying to sit up. Pain forced him back down with a curse. "Stop moving," Reese muttered, stepping closer. "You nearly bled to death." Kale ignored that completely. His eyes moved across Reese carefully, checking for injuries all over again, like he still did not fully believe he was safe. Then something darker crossed his face. The alpha looked away first. "I shouldn't have gone there." Reese frowned. "What? You saw me?" Kale's voice dropped lower. "What I become?" Silence settled heavily between them. Kale stared down at the bandages covering his scarred hands. "That's why I stayed away from people for years. That's why Omegas were scared of me." His jaw tightened painfully. Sooner or later, violence always wins. Reese felt something crack softly inside his chest. Slowly, he stepped closer until he stood beside the hospital bed. "You came for me. That doesn't change what I am. It changes everything." Kyle laughed quietly then, but the sound broke halfway through. "You still don't understand." His eyes finally lifted toward Reese again, raw and exhausted and terrified in ways no one else would ever believe possible from a man like him. "If I lose control completely around you someday." Reese cut him off by kissing him. Not gentle this time, not hesitant. A real kiss, filled with fear, relief, exhaustion, and all the emotions neither of them knew how to survive anymore. Kale froze completely beneath him. Reese pulled back just enough to whisper shakily against his mouth, "Then mark me." The entire room went silent. Kale stared at him like he had stopped breathing. Reese's pulse thundered wildly now, but he forced himself to continue. "I trust you. I choose you. So if you want me." "No." The answer came instantly. Firm. Broken. Reese blinked in shock. Kale lifted one trembling hand carefully against Reese's cheek. His expression was filled with something dangerously close to heartbreak. "No," he repeated softly. "Not like this. Kale, I spent my whole life watching powerful alphas take what they wanted because their instincts told them they could." His thumb brushed gently beneath Reese's eye. "I'm not doing that to you." Emotion clogged painfully in Reese's throat. "You already saved me." Kale shook his head slowly. "That's exactly why I can't." His voice roughened slightly. "I need to know you'd still choose me when you don't feel cornered, grateful, or afraid." The words shattered something open inside Reese completely. Because after everything Kale had suffered, after all the violence carved into his body, he still loved carefully enough to put Reese's freedom before his own instincts. Tears burned unexpectedly behind Reese's eyes. Cal noticed immediately and panicked. "Hey, don't cry. I'm sorry, I didn't mean." Reese kissed him again before he could finish. This time, Cal kissed him back, slowly, carefully, like something precious he still could not believe belonged in his hands. Months later, spring arrived quietly. The scandal surrounding Mackenzie Holdings slowly faded after Cale seized control of the company and dismantled several illegal alpha trafficking operations tied directly to the old board members. News outlets began calling him ruthless, unpredictable, dangerous. Reese privately thought they were only half right, because every evening, Hale still returned to the small house outside the city instead of the luxury penthouse waiting downtown. He still fixed leaks personally, still cooked terrible meals badly, still looked faintly surprised every time Reese curled against his side willingly. And Reese no longer belonged to the world that once tried to sell him. He built his own work instead, creating legal support programs for Omegas trapped in forced bonding contracts and abusive alpha-controlled families. The media called him rebellious now. He preferred free. One warm afternoon near the start of spring, Reese sat outside planting flowers beside the old porch while sunlight spilled softly across the hills around them. He heard footsteps behind him moments before familiar arms wrapped carefully around his waist. Cale rested his face against the side of Reese's neck and breathed him in slowly. Safe. Home. No words were needed after that. Because two broken people who had once tried desperately to escape the lives chosen for them had finally discovered something neither power nor instinct could force into existence. A love freely given. And for the first time in both their lives, freedom no longer felt lonely. Maybe that was the real miracle of their story. Not the power, not the scandals, not the danger, but the fact that two people, once treated like monsters and property, finally found a place where they could simply be loved. The first time someone called Reese Mr. Mackenzie in public, he laughed so hard that the reporter asking the question looked genuinely frightened. It happened at a charity benefit. One of those events Reese had once attended as his mother's bargaining chip, now attended as himself. He stood near the edge of the ballroom in a simple dark suit, no family crest on his collar, no price tag hidden beneath silk. Cale had been pulled away by a board member 5 minutes earlier and had left behind a warning look that made 3 alphas physically step back from Reese's personal space. The reporter, a young beta who clearly hadn't read the full briefing, smiled nervously. "Mr. Mackenzie, how does it feel to be the first Omega spouse in your family's history to hold independent legal status outside the bonding contract?" Reese stopped laughing. He tilted his head. "Independent legal status?" "Yes, the documents your husband filed last month. He transferred 23% of his personal holdings into your name. Without a bonding clause, no alpha override, no ownership stipulations." The reporter's voice dropped to a whisper. "No one has ever done that before." Reese went very still. 23%. He had known about the transfer. Cale had mentioned it offhandedly one night while washing dishes, as if discussing the weather. "Sign some papers today. You'll get mail about it. Don't throw it away." Reese had assumed it was household accounts. Maybe a safety fund. Not nearly a quarter of Mackenzie Holdings. His mother would have wept. Not from pride. From loss. "I didn't know the exact number," Reese said carefully. Then, because he refused to let the old shame rise, he added, "But that sounds like something you should ask him. I'm not his keeper." The reporter opened her mouth to press further. She never got the chance. A familiar scent flooded the space beside Reese. Smoke, cold rain, and something darker beneath. Cale appeared without a sound, one scarred hand settling against the small of Reese's back. His presence alone made the nearby alphas lower their eyes. "Problem?" Cale asked. His voice was mild. His pheromones were not. The reporter shook her head rapidly and retreated. Reese turned slightly, looking up at the man who had once been called a monster, who still flinched inside every time someone flinched at his scars. 23%. Cal's jaw tightened. You weren't supposed to find out like that. How was I supposed to find out? I was going to tell you. Eventually, Cal's hand pressed a little firmer against his back, grounding. After you stopped looking at me like I might disappear. Reese's chest ached. I don't look at you like that. You do. Every time I walk out the door. Cal's voice dropped lower, meant only for him. Every time I come home late. Every time I raise my voice at a board meeting and you hear about it on the news. His thumb traced a slow circle through the fabric of Reese's jacket. You're waiting for me to become what they always said I was. The ballroom hummed around them. Champagne glasses, polite laughter, the machinery of wealth pretending to be harmless. Reese ignored all of it. I'm not waiting for you to become anything, he said quietly. I'm waiting for you to stop believing you're still that person. Cal's expression cracked, just slightly, just enough for Reese to see the exhaustion beneath. I killed 3 men in that warehouse. They were going to kill me. That doesn't make it right. No. Reese reached up and touched the scar crossing Cal's cheek. The one that made strangers cross the street. The one that had once made Reese's Omega instinct scream danger. Now it just felt like home. It makes you someone who refused to let me die. There's a difference, Cal. You taught me that. Something fragile passed between them. Then Cal exhaled slowly and leaned down until his forehead pressed briefly against Reese's. I don't deserve you, he murmured. Too bad. Reese smiled. You're stuck with me. They left the gala early, as they always did. The penthouse waited. Cold, marble, perfect. But Cal turned the car toward the small house at the edge of the woods instead. The one with the leaking roof and the creaking floors and the garden Reese had planted with his own hands. The drive was quiet, comfortable. Reese watched the city lights fade into darkness, then into the soft glow of distant trees. I'm not going to run, he said eventually. Cal's hands tightened on the steering wheel. I know. Then stop waiting for me to. Silence. Then Cal pulled the car over to the side of the empty road. The engine idled softly. Rain began to tap against the windshield. I had a nightmare last night, Kyle admitted. His voice was rough. You were back in that warehouse. I couldn't reach you. I could hear you calling my name, and I couldn't. He stopped. His jaw worked silently. Reese unbuckled his seatbelt and shifted across the bench seat until he was pressed against Cal's side. He took one of those scarred, trembling hands and pressed it flat against his own chest, right over his heart. Feel that? Reese asked. Cal nodded, barely breathing. I'm here. I'm alive. And I'm not going anywhere. Reese held his gaze. But you have to start believing that. Because I can't keep watching you destroy yourself over something that already happened. The rain grew heavier. Inside the truck, Kyle Mackenzie, the heir who had torn through enemies, the alpha who had made board members weep, the monster everyone feared, broke. Not loudly, not violently, just a soft, shattered exhale. And then his face pressed against Reese's neck, and his arms wrapped around him like he was the only solid thing left in a collapsing world. I don't know how, Cal whispered. Reese held him tighter. Then we learn. Together. They stayed like that until the rain stopped. And when they finally drove home, Cal's hand stayed curled around Reese's, not holding him still, not claiming him, just there. Warm, present, no longer running. For 2 people who had spent their whole lives waiting to be discarded, that small, simple thing was nothing short of a miracle. Outside the small house, the forest whispered in the dark. Inside, a light stayed on, and 2 broken people kept choosing each other, one day at a time. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was better. It was real.